Y'all, we talked about adoption last week, and now we're getting back to the heavy stuff, hate crimes. What's a hate crime? Are they rising? They are. So, sit tight as we explore the very interesting world of what hate crimes are and how they play out in real life. Welcome back to #Lawyered, y'all. You have your legal A-team, Austin and Andrea, here live in studio.
Good to be back, and this we're going to talk about a pretty heavy subject today.
It is.
But that's part of why we do this show, is talk about the subject, because people need to know about these types of issues and how they get to the point of where they are. Because I especially think that the term hate crime, it's thrown around and used probably far more than it should be in just common discussion.
Absolutely. It's used a lot. I think people don't really have an understanding of what a hate crime entails.
Right.
And, interestingly, I think you would have some people, most people, I think, right, that we normally interact with are like, oh, hate crimes are terrible, not really knowing what they are. But I've also run across individuals who, generally they're a little bit older,
right.
who say, well, hate crimes are ridiculous because murder's a murder, or vandalism's vandalism, arson's arson. Like, why do we have this subjective enhancement? It should just be based on the demerit that occurred.
Yeah, and a lot of that's obviously very politically charged, political viewpoints at least, kind of like you were mentioning there. And so I think if everybody just taking the objective view, I think everybody would say, okay, someone who murders someone, that's not okay. If it's taking all the subjective facts out of it,
of course,
that's not okay. I'm not okay with the crime. And then when you slap the hate crime the hate crime label onto it, then that's where you start to get people that have strong personal feelings because they feel that there may be reverse discrimination going on or whatever it is. Why is it different that these two, why is the crime punished differently because these two individuals had a different race or religious belief? And so I see all that. I think everyone's got a different viewpoint, but this has come about because of a change in societal viewpoints. I mean,
absolutely.
The way our legislature should work, it's change with how our society ebbs and flows, right?
Absolutely. Change, y'all. Change is in the air. It's 2020. What can we say? So, all that to say, let's swing it back. Why are we even talking about hate crimes in the first place?
Yeah. Right? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as well as because, one, people need to understand about it.
Of course.
You understand what it is. And then also, and part of this may be because it's a newer body of laws.
Yeah.
But we're seeing a rise in, the way that these laws, more of these crimes being classified as that, and so it goes into how do you look at these things as we move forward as a society.
Absolutely, and it's really relevant too, right? Like you were saying, there's been a rise in these classification of crimes that are called hate crimes, and in fact, not all states have hate crime laws. There are federal hate crimes, there are state hate crimes. Texas has a state hate crime law, and we'll get into that. But states that do have hate crimes, right, if one of them occurs, generally, and this is a huge generalization, there's some bureaucratic method in which they're supposed to be reported to the FBI, right?
Right.
So the FBI keeps track of the amount of hate crimes that occur each year. And the FBI started collecting this data somewhere in the 1990s, right? Ancient history. I was alive then.
Well, and to me that's interesting because I'm not aware of, I'm sure there may be, but at least we don't hear about a situation where state crimes need to get reported to the FBI like this.
Right, so it's really different.
Yeah.
And so this is another, I think, issue where some people who are very much, like we said earlier, why the subjective enhancement, are like, well, why do we have our state police reporting information to federal bodies?
Right.
Like, what's up with that? And they're not cool with that. And I'm like, well, we'll get into that. We'll discuss that. But, all that to say is that, according to the data, hate crimes have been the highest they've been for a decade. And hate-motivated killings have reached their all-time high since the data collection process began. And I think it's not just 2020 that's causing all of this.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that 2020 is a microcosm of some of the polarizing viewpoints we have in our country, which unfortunately, hopefully not, but unfortunately that probably will lead to more crimes like this because we have a country right now that is so polarized, so opposite. And that's kind of what hate crime deals with, is people that are on opposite ends of the spectrum that whoever the aggressor is, whatever, not important, but the viewpoints and their lifestyles and who they are as a human typically are on opposite ends of the spectrum. And so it's important to understand these things. And I also think, and I won't hog all the time here talking about this, but I also think that the media does a bad job of throwing the term. We talked about society throwing the term around. I think the media just lassos that thing
Absolutely.
that lassos that thing in because it's clickbait. People are going to listen. It sounds, it's incendiary, and so it's important for people to understand, okay, when they say that, let me dive in, really figure out, is this actually a hate crime? And I think that's probably one thing you and I can both agree that that's a big reason we want people to understand
Absolutely.
these things.
We want people to understand the law. Like if something is classified as a hate crime, like we want you to actually be able to understand if it is or not, because let's be real, the media, they're not lawyers.
Right.
I mean, maybe they have a lawyer guest speaker once in a while, but the talking heads on the screen are not generally lawyers, and our listeners are all smart people, and they can understand when they are given accessible information what is a hate crime. So let's get into it, right? So let's see. We've had a lot of hate crimes recently. We just discussed that. But one thing I did want to note, actually, before we delve into the definition, is going back to the fact that state agencies usually state police, are going to be reporting to the FBI. So while we said that hate crimes are at an all-time high, I did want to bring attention to the fact that a lot of reports have come out saying that this number is actually probably quite low.
Okay.
And so
the actual statistical number that's reported. Okay.
So apparently only 13% of participating agencies actually do report hate crimes to the FBI. And so that's sad. That's something that needs to be worked on.
Right.
But I'm not surprised, right? I mean, look at how many times rape victims actually report the crime.
Yeah.
There's that level of like shame, of fear, of denial. And so I think maybe there's some sort of, obviously two extremely different awful experiences. Right. But I almost wonder if some of that same hesitancy to report, you see that in hate crimes, or if there's some other systemic issues with the data collection.
Yeah, and that was the second part I was going to bring up, because I bet in addition to it, there's some bureaucratic problems, because you've got a left hand talking to right hand problem when you've got federal system, state system, and the different agencies that are composed, and also just agencies within the federal system, agencies within the state system. There's just a lot of moving parts there, a lot of red tape. So I bet that's part of it too.
Yeah.
And that is a problem, because the whole idea of them reporting is, okay, well, they want to be able to track this information so we can figure out how do we address it.
Absolutely.
Never going to be able to fix it, but how do we address it?
How do we address it? How do we come up with the best, solution or methodology for mitigating what's going on? And I think part of it too is that a lot of police officers are not given the appropriate training, right? Police officers, they're not lawyers.
Right.
They're cops. They're not expected to know everything we know, and they don't need to. I mean, that's a lot of work for a cop to go to law school and go to, I don't know what you call cop school, but cop school. And,
police training, we'll call it that.
Police training.
Well, and think about it. A police officer's on the scene. He needs to investigate, figure out what's going on, and he or she, needs to investigate, figure out what's going on. Is there an offense here that justifies someone being arrested because there's probable cause? What witnesses do we need to talk to? How do we need to preserve this evidence? We don't need them also thinking about, okay, well, how does this fit within the statutory classification of the hate crime? That's the reason, should be later on down the road that decision gets made. And I know we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit later.
But that's what we want our police officers doing the best job they can.
Absolutely.
Which is focused on the things they're trained to do.
Absolutely. So, okay, y'all, now for real this time, we're actually going to go into what a hate crime is. I've kept you hanging for so long. So, at the end of the day, according to the FBI, what is a hate crime? So, a hate crime, pursuant to the FBI, is, Austin?
It's a criminal offense against a person or property motivated in whole or in part by an offender's bias against a race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. And I wanted to make sure I read that, because you don't want to paraphrase that. You want to understand how encompassing that is.
And I want people to understand that's according to the FBI. So this is a federal definition that we're dealing with.
Right.
And we're going to get in later. I think it's really important, right? That's the federal definition.
Yep.
States vary wildly, including Texas. So anyhow, Austin, if I was a really terrible, hateful person, sorry this is polarizing, y'all. If I was a terrible, hateful
Don't
person.
apologize about being polarizing. That's part of why we're here.
And we have, let's say, Jane, Susie Q. Susie Q is terrible. And Susie Q says, I am going to go and write terrible things and spray paint on my classmate's house because she's Jewish and I hate Jews.
Right.
And she does that. And she writes terrible things about her Jewish classmate because Susie Q is a terrible person.
Right.
And is that going to be a hate crime?
It will, because you've got vandalism.
Yep.
So, and that's one of the points. You've got to actually commit a crime for it to become a hate crime. It can't just be hateful speech. And then you've got the religious
aspect of it.
Religious aspect of it, that you could say, okay, she was motivated. Susie Q was motivated by her classmate's religion to go post those things.
So, and I think that's really important, right? Because if Susie Q, we take that situation and she was just at school and she was telling her friends, oh, I can't stand Jane Doe because Jane Doe is Jewish.
Yeah.
Ugh, I hate Jews. Well, okay, first of all, terrible. Susie Q should never be thinking or saying that. But with that speech in of itself, would that be a hate crime?
No, it wouldn't be a hate crime. She's a bad human being, but it wouldn't be a hate crime.
Okay, so I think then that's really important for people to understand. Like, you
Absolutely.
actually have to have at the federal level, and then as we'll get into at the state level, you actually have to have literally a crime and be actually indicted for a crime.
Right, in the federal system, yep.
In the federal system, in order for the hate crime process to even really begin.
Right. So really, and the way I usually think about this, you're charged with a crime, and I'll use Texas because it does translate.
Sure.
Actually, no, let's go with the federal system. You're charged with a crime, and it's listed in the federal laws as, okay, this is the crime, and then you can have enhancements on that crime that kick it up a notch to where your sentencing level may go up. Well, will go up if there's an enhancement.
Yes.
So, if an assault is committed with a firearm, you've got the assault and then boom, firearm, add a couple more months to the sentence, whatever it is. That's the way I think about the hate crime addition, is that you've got, here's the crime, and then because it's a hate crime, you've enhanced that assault, that vandalism, whatever it is, by some certain amount of points that gets you a longer sentence at that point.
Absolutely. And so why is this a law? Like, why is this a thing, right? Like, what's the purpose? What was the legislature's intent?
Well, and I was thinking about this earlier when you were talking about the statistics part, because the statistics themselves, I'm going to start back here and kind of work through it, in my opinion, because the statistics are important, because then that helps guide our legislature with coming up with the sentencing guidelines that we use. And so in the federal system, like a lot of people are aware of, there's not like a just wide open sentencing pool for the jury or the judge to render on the criminal defendant if they're convicted. So if you're convicted of a crime, there's a grid, and we won't go into all the details of the grid, but there's a grid with a number of months on it, and you start at a certain level. If there's enhancements, you go up, and then the judge just says, okay, boom, that's that person's sentence.
It's very specific.
It is.
And there's not a lot of wiggle room or leeway. I mean, I think a lot of people think that judges, when it comes to sentencing, first of all, I don't think people really understand that at the criminal level in federal court, you have your guilt or innocence phase of trial, and then you have a separate, like, bifurcated phase of trial called your sentencing hearing. And at sentencing, there's not a lot of wiggle room. The judge can't say, well, I think you're really a good person, so community service.
Right.
It's, well, I have the discretion between giving you 120 months in jail or 122 months in jail.
Right.
I'm going to go with 121.
Yeah.
Obviously hyperbole, but that would be, I think, an example of how strict these guidelines are and how little wiggle room the judges and the prosecutors actually have.
Absolutely. And just to reinforce a point too, big difference in the federal system versus state.
Yes.
Juries don't sentence in the federal system. Only the judge can, which is very different than like in our state in Texas, where the jury can sentence. But like with the hate crime idea, say that you've got it, let's use an assault. And let's say the assault starts within the statute, it says you start at a level 22, you go across, okay, that's 120 months. Hate crime enhancement, I'm just making numbers up here, so don't quote me on this. This is not USSG compliant here. Say the hate crime adds an extra 6 months to it, adds 2 points, you go over at 6 months. Well, the judge has got to find, was there a hate crime, does it fit that mold? And then there's usually a range, so let's say it's 126 to 132, then the judge has a decision to make there as to, like you were just talking about, whether it falls in that range or not. So I think that the statistics are important, because I think that probably trickles through and would help guide the legislature on, okay, well, how do we need to classify these hate crimes as a deterrent, as punishment, because that's what our prison system is for, is that and some other things. But deterring these crimes later, that's why it's important to know the stats, and also why the hate crime aspect is punished specifically is because that hateful act is something our legislature has said that's something that's important to us, that makes it more severe when someone commits that crime, because it's bad for society, bad for their constituents, all those things.
Absolutely. And I want to tag on to that. I think you did a really good job explaining it. And I think too, right, especially when you're looking at the federal level, look at who's protected, right? A hate crime, if you commit an assault against someone based on their race, their religion, their gender, their ethnicity, or sexual orientation. Remember, we talked about what does this sound like? Let me backtrack. What do these sound like? These sound like protected classes.
Right.
And where do we get the idea of protected classes from?
Equal protection clause in the 14th Amendment, and I knew that's where you're going with that, because that's exactly what it is that we care about protecting those classes that are protected by the 14th Amendment since the Civil Rights Movement and everything else.
Because these classes are more vulnerable. More vulnerable to being attacked by hateful people, or by just very ignorant people. Some don't attribute to malice, but you can attribute to ignorance, someone once told me. And so I find it interesting too that sexual orientation is in here, right? Because it wasn't until we had our recent Supreme Court case that we discussed on the podcast that also said that, hey, sexual orientation, right? If you're gay, you're lesbian, or if you're transgender, right? That falls into the protected class of sex.
Right.
So I found that really interesting that federally that was already mandated and that there was no confusion about it like there was maybe with the the original language of the protected classes.
Well, and I think you could probably go even deeper about maybe a bigger policy reason too, is that if you think about this, again, the polarization of these issues, we're trying to get back to the Equal Protection Clause by making these more intense. These are also more likely to incite fear and rage and these types of offenses.
Sure.
You've got a regular, I'm gonna call it regular murder. There's no such thing, but you've got a non-hate crime murder. Let's call it that. Versus a hate crime murder in a rural community that all of a sudden the entire community is figuratively set ablaze. You want to be able to keep the, part of law enforcement's job to keep the peace. Well, given these tools, this helps try to deter some of that and say, we're not going to just stand for, okay, well, just because you killed someone that you weren't racially motivated to kill him, and you killed someone that you were going to treat those differently because it causes so much societal problems.
Yeah, I see where you're going with that, and I think that makes a lot of sense, right? And if you are a KKK member and you set a cross on fire in someone's yard and then maybe turn around and set their house on fire, right? I think that there does need to be some extra deterrence and extra motivation to not do that.
Right.
Because then, who knows, maybe if there's a chapter there that could sweep and encourage other members of the chapter to encourage such hateful activity. So I think it makes a lot of sense, right, for the legislature to step in and say this is absolutely unacceptable to our society, we will not tolerate it, and provide these enhancements and make those hate crimes.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So, all right, well, guys, that was the federal system, and we discussed federally what hate crimes are, okay? And then I do want to mention that there are also specific hate crime laws federally, right? So we've got the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crime Preventions Act of 2009. We've got criminal interference with right to fair housing, damage to religious property, Church Arson Prevention Act, violent interference with federally protected rights, and conspiracy against rights.
Yeah.
So these are all codified federal law protecting against hate crimes.
And going into the state side, it's important, kind of a segue to point out, I think it's just obvious, but sometimes a little nuanced. You can be charged either at the state level or the federal level for a hate crime. And it doesn't, if you commit a federal crime and the hate crime aspect tacks onto it, you're there. You commit a state crime and the hate crime aspect tacks onto it, you're there. So it can go either way depending on whether you break a federal law or a state law.
Yeah, so guys, don't try to play the system. It'll get you. All right, so Texas. Texas does currently have a hate crime statute on the books, and not all the states do. Right? There are some states that don't have any hate crimes. There are states that have a hate crime law, but they're basically a joke because they have no teeth.
Right.
Texas, we do. We have a hate crime statute with teeth. And so, Austin, if someone is feeling extremely nerdy, aka me, and they want to look up in the Texas Penal Code where the hate crime statute is, where are they going to look?
Well, they're going to look in the Code of Criminal Procedure, and this is important, and I won't law nerd out too much on this stuff, but
okay.
in Texas, we've got a penal code, which has all the laws of assault is this. You can't hit somebody knowingly and cause injury to them. That's an assault. Then we have a code of criminal procedure, which governs every other aspect of criminal law in Texas other than the actual baseline offenses. So the penal code is not that long.
It's actually quite short.
It's pretty short. And the reason is because the Code of Criminal Procedure is extremely long because it covers everything from how is probation determined, how is someone eligible for probation, how are sentences enhanced. So there's certain offenses that just everybody's really paying attention called 3G offenses that if you commit those, you're not eligible for parole until you've served day for day, or excuse me, you're not eligible for parole, period. So there's things like that that are in the Code of Criminal Procedure. And so the classification of a hate crime is more of a procedural enhancement, and that's why it's found in the Code of Criminal Procedure versus the Penal Code. And again, I'll stop here so we don't go too deep into this rabbit hole, but the idea is that the entire Code of Criminal Procedure is available and able to apply to the different statutes in the Penal Code. And so that's why they did it that way. So you've got, here's your baselines, and then any enhancements, any procedures, any punishments, all that stuff can kind of wholesale. You can cross-reference and apply the two when you're trying to figure out what is your client facing, what can they be charged with, all those types of things.
Very neat and tidy.
It's actually extremely messy, to be honest.
Oh, well, you know what? I was just trying to give you a compliment.
No, I know, but the Code of Criminal Procedure can get very confusing. You can get lost very quickly. So anyways, that comes from experience.
All right, so let's go ahead and move towards Texas hate crimes, right? So, in Texas, it's similar. So let's go. Apparently, I'm on a fire kick today. I don't know why. Arson.
Well, arson. I mean, it's a good one to talk about though, because it does. I mean, the KKK are famous for doing that.
Yes.
And it's setting fire to things is not maybe as intense as someone actually going in and intentionally trying to go kill somebody.
Sure.
People like to destroy stuff, so I think it makes a lot of sense to use that as an example.
Oh, thank you, Austin. I feel so validated. All right, so let's go ahead and say Susie Q is here in Dallas, right? She's terrible. She hates her Jewish friend, or not friend, classmate, Jane Doe, definitely not friend.
Yeah.
She'd be even worse.
Right.
Hey, Jane Doe, and she goes and sets, let's just make it really black and white. She sets a Star of David on fire, and she sets the house on fire. So 2 for 2, very terrible. And I say the house, right, because there are restrictions within the definition of what arson is.
Right.
And so
right.
That's why
Got to get to the building.
Got to get to the building.
Yeah.
We're using that in the example. So she gets arrested. Austin, take it away from there. How is that going to look procedurally in Texas once she's arrested for arson in this situation? Right.
So she'll be arrested for arson. The police will make a determination that there's probable cause. They'll take it to the judge, issue an arrest warrant. We're going to assume that this is going to be a felony, so she's going to get indicted.
What type of felony?
Actually, to be honest, as I sit here, I'm not sure which degree it is.
That was a trick question. I'm sorry. I did that to make myself look good. I'm sorry. I was being really mean.
That's okay.
So generally,
this is actually a good learning lesson that lawyers don't have everything memorized. We know where to go find stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead.
So generally, as I understand it, arson is most usually a second-degree felony, but it can go up or down depending on the severity of the property damage and also if anyone was actually injured while they were inside the building as a result of the arson or, God forbid, died.
Right.
So it can change, but most typically second degree.
Yeah, and those are those enhancements you were kind of talking about.
Those
so
are
I've never actually worked on an arson case, to be fair. So I've never actually had to look at the statute for that before.
Okay, well, I've never had an arson case either, so there you go.
So second degree felony, they got to be indicted.
Sure.
And we talked about this in our Criminal Defense 101, Criminal Law 101 episode.
Yeah.
Got to go before a grand jury. The grand jury is going to decide was it likely that this crime occurred based on the evidence. Let's say they indict Susie Q. So then a case will be filed, and then eventually along the way, because they're going to indict her for arson, and they're going to in the indictment, they're going to ask for the enhancement of the hate crime. So that's going to be in the indictment, and for it to get to move past that, the grand jury's got to say, yes, we believe that there's some probable cause here that she actually committed this with the hate crime definition, which we'll get into in a second.
And so that's really important, right? Because I want everyone to remember that at the indictment level, it's just probable cause, right? It was there's probable cause that she committed this arson based on her bias against her classmates' religion.
Right.
And that's different once we get to trial, right? This is just the indictment level.
It is. And that's actually, we can take a little aside here to explain, you know, once someone's indicted, the state can't amend the indictment and change it or add, for example, if they just indicted her for arson and they get 6 months down the road, say you're on the eve of trial, and then the prosecutor realizes, oh no, we need to charge this as a hate crime. Well, they have to ask the judge for permission to amend that indictment. And at that late in the game, the judge isn't going to let them do that, pending certain circumstances. Or the judge is going to kick the trial out for you know, another 6 months or whatever, because you can't surprise somebody like that. Because as we were talking about earlier, the hate crime classification is an enhancement on the penalty, and so that would be unfair if they could just night before trial say, oh, also there's a hate crime enhancement, so it's going to add an extra potentially 5 years to your sentence or whatever.
Which is extremely unfair, because that completely throws out the window any prior like plea deals or negotiations. I mean, it wrecks the entire system.
Well, yeah, and the defense lawyer, we're preparing to defend this person for arson. Well, we didn't realize we also had to try to attack the
hate crime
aspect, saying that the accusation that this is racially motivated, or in this case, motivated by religion. So at the indictment stage in this situation, they would ask that the grand jury indict her for arson with the hate crime enhancement based on the definition. If they did indict her, then they would move forward. And at trial, like you were kind of alluding to a second ago, they've got to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she committed the crime.
Yes.
But then they've also got to find that the hate crime enhancement occurred too. It's not just like a wholesale thing.
And that, I think, is so important for people to understand.
Right.
Is that because the hate crime is an enhancement, you're increasing the punishment in order to comply with the, you know, due process, right? That the accused is constitutionally guaranteed. Not only do they have to find beyond a reasonable doubt that she committed the act of arson, but that she committed the act of arson and she was motivated partially or in whole by her bias against her classmates' Jewish faith.
Right.
And so I think that's incredibly important, because there was a lot of case law in Texas, you know, when the hate crime statute first came out, because there were some constitutional problems with it, because the statute didn't specifically say beyond a reasonable doubt as to the hate crime enhancement portion. And that's a big problem.
It is, yeah.
Right? I mean, this is someone's liberties we're dealing with.
Right, and you're talking about adding years or whatever to their sentence. It needs to be constitutionally acceptable, and so that makes a lot of sense, and that's important. That's why, I mean, if you think about and break that down, that's why a hate crime offense, when you're putting that in the context of a trial, I mean, if you think about this, okay, we're going to put on evidence of someone saw her purchase the lighter fluid and the match, someone saw her car driving down the road, all these things. And now, in your example, there's a Star of David, so that makes it a little easier. But even past that, they're going to have to bring out evidence of people to come in and testify. Okay, we've seen her make comments before about this, and so evidence that may not necessarily have been relevant to just the crime of arson may now get in because it's an element of the offense that she's been charged with, and so this is going to sound a little funny. It puts her at a disadvantage because now we've kind of got some quasi-character evidence coming in that may otherwise be inadmissible. Now, the fact is, if she was racially motivated, I mean, I don't really care that much that it comes in, you know. But it does. What it does is, in a roundabout way, it makes it more difficult on the defense of the case, because now, basically, the idea that she's a terrible human being gets to come in because it comes as part of the element of the hate crime.
You know, and guys, you know, we have outlines for these discussions because to keep us on track. But we're gonna jump the outline here.
You got to freestyle.
We're gonna freestyle here, because I think this is really, really important to discuss, is the concept of evidence that wasn't otherwise permissible coming in. And I wanted to really hit on the fact, too, that proving a hate crime, like, again, going back to those older individuals that I referenced in the earlier part of the episode who are very opposed to the concept of a hate crime and think it's very subjective. This is where I want to say it's not really that subjective.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Because the amount of evidence that you have to put on to prove bias, right, of the accused, you're proving someone's mental state.
Yeah.
And Austin, I mean, as a lawyer, you know how incredibly difficult that is to prove.
Right.
And the amount of evidence that you have to put on and the amount of familiarity someone needs to have with the evidentiary rules here in Texas to get in text messages, testimony,
prior bad acts,
social media posts, things that would show the accused's state of mind and her racial or religious motivation, or so on and so forth. It takes a lot of work and a lot of finagling to get that in, because and I want to remind our listeners, generally information like that, it doesn't come in because it's not relevant.
Right.
And you can't put on, generally, there are, of course, a couple of major exceptions, character evidence.
Right.
Right. And so let's just remind our listeners, what is character evidence in general?
Paraphrase version of it is basically evidence of who you are as a person, whether you're a good person, bad person, and it's qualitative ideas of things that could potentially sway the jury. So a great example of character evidence that can come in certain situations and not necessarily in the hate crime idea, but prior convictions does go into character evidence. So in a DWI trial, like DWI, first time you've ever been arrested, driving while intoxicated, if someone can't come in and say, this guy's a drunk, he's always at the bar, he's always drunk, he's always belligerent, out of control, that's not allowed. Now, if you're on trial for a DWI second, means that you've been arrested second time for DWI. Typically a prior conviction of some other crime, so say like an assault, that can't come in, but your first DWI can, because that's a part of, they have to prove you've been arrested twice for DWI. So that's an example of, that normally wouldn't come in, but now, because it's part of the crime you're being charged with, it's allowed to come in, and that's tough, because then the jury's going to think, well, yeah, this guy is a drunk. This is the second time he's been arrested,
Yeah, and it makes him look really bad.
Right.
And so, let's talk about this, right? A little bit more. Examples of what evidence can be brought in to prove the concept of bias, right? To prove that Susie Q was motivated by her hatred for Judaism to act. So, and because this is a newer area of law, there's not that much case law on it.
Right.
But, we do have an example of Janes versus State, which is out of Corpus Christi back in 2006. So, we have this case, and this was not a religious case. This was racially motivated. Long story short, you had a young black man who was at, I believe it was a bar or restaurant and bar, one of the two. And then you had this intoxicated white young man there with his girlfriend, and the white man was being very belligerent. He was saying extremely disrespectful things. He was using the most severe racial slurs you could possibly use against a black man. And this eventually resulted in a fight, and the man, the white man, whips off his shirt. He's got this giant swastika tattooed on his stomach, which, by the way, tattoos on a stomach, I feel like that's probably not the best place, but...
Yeah. That's a whole nother thing.
That's a whole nother thing. Anyway, and so eventually, they get into a fight outside, and, they're injured, the police are called, and then the, white young man is then arrested for assault, I believe.
Right.
And so when it comes to the trial, right, he's accused of a hate crime.
Right.
And he's like, well, you can't bring in evidence. It wasn't a hate crime. He was just looking at my girlfriend wrong, and I would have beat up any guy for looking at my girlfriend like that. That's just rude.
Right.
And he's like, and he started it, by the way. He came up to me. And of course, the victim's like, well, I went over to tell you that that's not okay for you to use language like that.
Right.
Like, I'd like you to please not do that. And then this bar scene erupted.
Sure.
So at the end of the day, like, what was actually able to come in? So what did the attorneys, or the prosecutors, use to show that this was a racially motivated crime?
Well, it's some of the stuff we were kind of talking about earlier. Racial slurs that were lodged in his direction at the bar, those are relevant. The text messages that maybe show this person's racial bias towards him. I think you make a great point. In the pre-show outline that it's got to be relevant, which now it's now relevant because it's a hate crime. You've been charged with a hate crime, so these ideas are relevant.
So that swastika on his stomach is now relevant.
It's now relevant. It's got to be reliable, though. And so why don't you tell our listeners a little bit of what you mean by the reliability?
Sure, absolutely. So reliability is going to, I think, usually goes to hearsay.
Right.
So you need the evidence to be reliable. And for example, the reason we don't let in hearsay in general, of course there are exceptions and carve-outs, is because people's memory or what they heard, when you think about it, you filter it, you repeat what you heard, but maybe it's not exactly what you heard. Your memory will alter things naturally. That's just the human mind. So we need evidence to be reliable in order to, if we're going to convict someone or we're going to enhance their charges, like, it needs to be good, strong evidence that was not subject to someone's misunderstanding or misinterpretation. I'm giving like a very like broad
absolutely. No, and that's what it is.
Concept, right? So obviously there are very like specific legal definitions that we won't bore you with, but that's kind of the general idea. So for example, normally what would not be allowed, right, is that the girlfriend says, oh, well, he uses the N-word every time we drive past a gas station and, we see some people just filling up their cars.
Yeah.
Doing nothing. They're just living their life.
Right.
Terrible. But normally that would be hearsay. But in this situation, it's his girlfriend. She's with him. This has occurred numerous times. She's under oath. She's there testifying in trial. She can be cross-examined about this. At this point, given all those circumstances, that evidence is going to be reliable.
Right.
Another piece of reliable evidence, multiple eyewitnesses saying, I saw the swastika on this man's stomach. Mm-hmm. You have multiple eyewitnesses saying that. So you're like, all right, this is, and they're up for cross-examination.
Right.
They can be examined on their testimony. That's reliable.
Yeah. Well, so, and I think that going through that example, I think it really illustrates what I hadn't thought about this earlier when you were talking about it until you started talking about it. But the idea that there's people that think that the hate crime enhancement is not fair because just because someone's of a different race or religion, then all of a sudden you're facing a larger sentence. The point is, you've got to prove all these things beyond a reasonable doubt. And so it's not just like, okay, well, you got the extra sentence. Well, the state has to meet that burden and show all these things.
Absolutely.
So, I agree with you that you're not all of a sudden creating a more draconian sentence to somebody. You're actually, you're kind of getting the pendulum swinging the way it should be.
Absolutely. And I want to give people an example, right, a hypothetical where it could have been a hate crime, right? But it wound up not being a hate crime because there wasn't enough evidence. So say we have Jane Doe. Jane Doe, this is a different Jane Doe, I know, it's so confusing. We've got Jane Doe number 2.
Yeah.
Jane Doe is, she's 29, she's married, but her husband is a drunk, he's an alcoholic, and he's a wife beater. Okay. So say he gets really drunk one night, comes home and beats the ever-living daylights out of her and breaks her arm. Well, according to federal statute, right, gender is a protected class.
That's a good point, yeah.
So could this be a hate crime? Well, maybe.
Right.
But, we need to get into the evidence because if her husband came home and said, Jane Doe, because you're a woman, I'm just going to beat up on you because I hate women, even though I'm married to one. Who knew?
Right.
But so that, evidence of that would be a hate crime. If he has text messages to his friends, he's like, women are inferior and, they need a good slapping around to be taught, or like, she should be lucky to be married to me. Like, women are subservient and women are lesser than men. All these things about how he hates women, they're so on and so forth. These would be evidence relevant towards proving up a hate crime.
Right.
Because he's basing his assault against his wife based on the fact that she's a woman.
Yeah.
Okay. But how realistic is that?
Not very, because really, and I bet gender, I don't have the statistics here, but gender is probably the least tapped into classification for hate crimes, because you think about it, that could play out in sexual assault, domestic violence, all those types of things. That's the more common violent crimes we think of. And so you don't see that very often. And the reason is if you really look at it, the crime's got to be motivated by the fact that this person is in that protected class. And so this is motivated by the fact that the guy's a jerk and he's a drunk and he's an abusive, father, husband, whatever.
And he's just awful.
Right, and not that she is a woman. Because that would be, if you think about that, think about trying to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury.
That would be hard.
It'd be very difficult, and that's why in this situation it wouldn't be there. And this wouldn't be a case where we'd want it to necessarily be there, because that's not why the hate crime enhancement was really created.
Exactly. So that's just one example then of how a hate crime wouldn't apply.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah, and honestly, I mean, my experience looking at these, and I'll be, admittedly, I've never defended a hate crime. Sure. Typically, when you see these cases, especially the more high-profile ones, usually the crime committed is pretty violent, and usually you can see there's some sort of very personal twist to it. And I mean that in a very negative way. I remember the very first hate crime I remember reading about, which actually I believe, if I recall, led to the codification of the law here in Texas, was a man in Jasper was tied up and dragged behind a pickup truck. And and I don't remember the outcome of the case. This was over, probably I was a kid when this happened. But it's a very violent crime. He didn't just shoot the guy. The guy went through a lot of pain and all those types of things.
He was tortured.
He was tortured. And so usually when you see these hate crimes, there's another policy reason why they're enhanced, is because typically there is somewhat of a sadistic twist to the crime that was committed because of how polarizing these issues are.
Yeah.
And so to me, and this is coming from a defense lawyer's perspective, I think it's highly justified because you're punishing something that's truly evil in that situation.
Absolutely. Something that's truly evil and just should not be tolerated by a society like ours at all, I think.
Right.
So now I think that people kind of have a good understanding of what hate crimes are and how they're motivated, and the difference between the state and federal levels. I do want to throw in one last difference at the state level. So, we noticed that in the federal definition, disability is included in that list of, and I'm using air quotes here, y'all, protected classes. Right. Because protected classes for the hate crime discussion. You'll notice that when you look at the Texas hate crime statute, it specifically does not apply to disabled people. And I find that to be interesting, that there is that difference. And there is different Texas state law that deals with crimes against the elderly, the disabled, and children. So I just wanted our listeners to be aware of that difference.
Well, and the first thing that came to my mind was the Americans with Disabilities Act is a federal act. So you could have a situation where someone could be charged both federally and at the state level for the same offense, and same action, same criminal episode, and at the state level they're charged and it's just an assault on a disabled person, and then at the federal level they could be charged with a hate crime, and because they have the disability carve out with the federal definition of it.
It's an ADA violation with hate crime enhancement.
And actually we won't get into this, but that's another point, that you can be charged for the same criminal episode, you can be charged at the state and the federal level. Now, there's some things that are going to have to get sorted out there, but especially in this circumstance where you violated a federal statute and a state statute, you see this a lot in drug cases. Usually it gets combined, but that's just something to keep in mind when it comes to how you look at federal versus state offenses.
You could have double the trouble.
Right.
So, all right, Austin, at the end of the day, I know we discussed data collection earlier. Do you have any thoughts on how we can better improve the data collection of hate crimes so that our legislature has more information to guide them in bettering and sophisticating and making more helpful the hate crime statutes at both the state and federal level?
I think it does start on the front lines. I'm going to go back a little bit on something I said earlier. I said that we want our police officers to be focused on their task at hand. There could be some more additional training to help them recognize, okay, should somebody look at this as a hate crime? They don't have to make the determination on the spot, but in their paperwork, because they do have to do extensive paperwork after making arrests and when they're investigating crimes. That could be something that's just on the front end, hey, detective needs to look into this part of it, or the DA needs to look into this part of it too. I think that starts there.
Absolutely.
And then, bureaucratic reporting systems are typically, they leave a lot to be certainly. So I'm sure there's some efficiencies and some effectiveness that can be improved in those systems, and that's probably where you have to talk to someone smarter than me when it comes to statistics and data collection, but I think there's probably some things that can be done better there.
But I definitely agree with you that a little bit more training for the police officers and giving them the option of saying, hey, based on the training I've received, I think this might be a hate crime. I saw Star of David being burned in the front lawn.
Because the idea is at least let someone look at, if the patrol officer who's making the initial investigations, kicking it up to a detective in the family violence unit who they are more trained, more experienced, then let's just raise the red flag. They may see it themselves, but let's start on the front lines.
Why not? Let's make sure that all our options are covered, and that the police officer is able to say, hey, I have concerns about this. Can someone look into it? So, awesome. And then, Austin, if someone has been the victim of a hate crime, what should they do?
You got to contact law enforcement. That's the first line. That's how all these processes start. Is I know some people, this is a common misconception. You think you call the DA's office. You don't do that. Call law enforcement, make a police report. That's how the process starts. And so that's where you go.
And should they write down like everything that happened to them, that to the best of their memory?
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's a great point. Is you're always going. We talked about reliability earlier. You're always going to remember something better the closer in time that you write it down, because you may think, no, I vividly remember what happened. Life happens, and you misremember things as time goes on. It's not anybody's fault. It's just how our human brains work, and that's just how it is. And sometimes, on a traumatic situation like this, I mean, sometimes your brain blocks trauma. It blocks pieces. I'm not a psychologist, but that happens.
It's a self-defense mechanism.
Right, and so that can create problems too. And so you definitely want to write, that's for all situations if you're a victim of a crime, write that stuff down, but then yes, definitely contact law enforcement.
Awesome. Well, 2 concrete tidbits to take away. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us again on #Lawyered and listening to another heavy subject. See you next time.
Thank you guys again for listening to us here on #Lawyered. Go find us on whatever platform it is that you listen to your podcasts. Go like the podcast, go follow and subscribe to us. Leave us a review, leave us a rating. That helps us to really get the word out and really continue to tell you guys about all the different things that are going on in law and business here in Dallas. Make sure you check out our videos on our YouTube channel. It's #Lawyered. And then also follow us on our Instagram account. It's at #Lawyered. DM us, send us some issues, some topics you'd like to discuss, or some things that maybe you just don't understand about the law, because we want to make sure and cover and give you what it is you want to listen to.
Welcome back to Closing Arguments, ladies and gentlemen. It may be the holiday season, but someone is not going to be home for Christmas. And it looks like Massimo Giannoli, the husband of Lori Loughlin, who was arrested and incarcerated for the college bribery scandal, won't be home for Christmas. That's right. He reported to the Federal Bureau of Prisons around November 19th, 2020, to start his time in prison for his participation in the college bribery scandal that he participated in with his wife, Lori Loughlin, of bribing officials at USC to take his 2 daughters in for college, and also doctoring photos of his 2 daughters to make them look like college caliber varsity rowing athletes. So don't doctor photos and don't bribe anyone. It's not worth it. Cheers.